So I am thrilled to have today Dr. Sonya Horsford. She is an expert on students of color in K through 12. And I saw her on the Chavis Chronicles, and I knew at that point I had to have her. And so she is here today, and I am thrilled to hear her conversation and presentation about the impact of COVID on communities of color, and particularly Black students. So this should be a really informative event, and I am really looking forward to it. So let's give Dr. Horsford a round of applause.
Thank you, Dr. Wright. Thank you so much, and thank you to the Cook Center for the invitation to be here for this really important conference and convening that's focused on pandemic and the pandemic divide. As Dr. Wright said, my name is Sonya Douglas, and I'm a faculty member at Teachers College, Columbia University, which is in New York, and I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague Alexandria Lowe, and we're here representing the Black Education Research Center, which is a center that I founded in 2017. We actually just became the center this year. We were founded in 2017 as the Black Education Research Collective, and it really stemmed from an interest that I've had for a long time in bringing together students and faculty who are really committed and particularly interested in the study and practice of education in service of Black children and peoples of African descent in the US and throughout the world. So we are really excited to be able to do the work that we do at the institution that we're in, but really centering community in everything that we do. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about the center and the work that we do in education, as well as a study that we conducted last year entitled Black Education in the Wake of COVID-19 and Systemic Racism Toward a Theory of Change and Action. And I do hope that we have time for a conversation. It is great to be in a space where so many different disciplines and ways of thinking about inequality are represented. All of those things inform what happens in schools and in education. And so part of what we try to do at Burke is really bring to bear the multiple disciplines that inform the work that schools interact with, whether it's history, anthropology, economics, political science, you name it. Those are the things that really shape what happens in schools and school communities. And so the mission and the vision, the purpose of the Black Education Research Center is to conduct and analyze research focused on improving the educational experiences and outcomes of students of African descent in the US and throughout the world. And while we have students, alumni, and faculty at Teachers College who are affiliated with the center, we also have faculty from across the country at various institutions, including one of my mentors, an advisory board member who's down the street at UNC Chapel Hill, Linda C. Tillman. I'm going to talk a little bit about her work and how it has informed our research methodologies at the Black Education Research Center. And just a little bit about myself. I'm a faculty member in education leadership, and so my work has really focused on issues of race, critical race theory, race and culture in education. My dissertation study looked at and examined the lived experiences and perspectives of Black school superintendents in K-12 school districts who attended all Black segregated schools and later led desegregated systems. And so my work really stems from, again, inquiry that looks at why we have inequality in education, what the root cause and sources of those inequality are. And much of my work has landed on the fact that racism and a history of institutional racism and discrimination has informed a lot of the inequalities that we see. And I think that the presentations that we've heard from earlier today continue to reflect that. And so what we are trying to do at Burke is not simply continuing to document the problem of inequality, or in some ways admire it, I would argue, in terms of how we continue to show how, in many cases, Black people are on the bottom and white people are on the top and others are in between. But rather think about the processes and the practices and the policies that are necessary to make those changes, to actually say that if we invest in these policies and practices and the development of people, that we'll be able to really address and counter the gatekeeping, the barriers, and the discrimination that have continued to keep peoples of color, and particularly peoples of African descent, in a really difficult position in the United States. And so in 2021, there was an emergency call for grant proposals focused on how COVID was impacting education by the Spencer Foundation. And we were fortunate enough to receive one of these. It was a fairly small grant, but we really seized the moment and in their interest in really being able to articulate how Black communities were experiencing COVID. And so if you recall, 2 years ago, there were so many news reports and research reports that were documenting and advancing this narrative of the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Black communities, right? So we heard that a lot, and many of us witnessed it. We saw it in terms of loss, in terms of the impact on employment, and in terms of what was happening in schools, and really shifting from this completely in-person environment. It depends on where you are, but in March, where you basically got the call and said, leave your things, leave campus, leave the classroom, we are in the middle of a pandemic, and that required the education sector to really think about how it would pivot and be able to continue to provide services and support to students through virtual learning, remote learning, et cetera. And those are things that we're still really battling with now, and so I want to just kind of underscore the fact that we're still dealing with COVID in many ways. The pandemic has taken on a different look and feel. I would argue that many of the questions that we had at the beginning of the pandemic still remain unanswered in terms of leadership, accountability, and again, how we want to reimagine and build something new as a result of what we learned over the last 2 years. And so, again, the data was collected in 2021, but I think that the findings still, again, help to point to some of the things that we need to continue to focus on if we really want to rebuild our education system. And so as part of this study, again, it was very exploratory and descriptive. We had a national survey where we had an online Qualtrics survey that we sent out across through social media and email to get as many responses as we could from students, from parents, from grandparents, community members, coaches, faith leaders, right? The people that sometimes we don't talk to or aren't really cited in the media, to just ask them 2 very basic questions. And that is, what is the impact of COVID-19 in your view on the education of Black children and youth? And how should educators and community leaders respond to calls for change and action? And so we really wanted to have more of a participatory approach and use a culturally sensitive research methodology, again, to center the experiences and the voices of the people who are closest to the challenge, right? We wanted to move it, we all are in the academy, and we think that there's great value of what we do in higher education, but we really wanted to do our best to build that relationship with community members in the 5 communities that we identified, and really take their direct quotes, their sentiments, their experiences, and their recommendations for what needs to happen. Because a lot of times we don't realize that the answers are already in the community. It's just whether or not we're going to listen, right? And so that's really, again, a larger aim of this report, was to amplify those voices and then begin a conversation on how we begin to fix it and address it. In terms of context, like I mentioned, we had a national online survey with 440 respondents, 19 focus group interviews with combinations of students, of teachers, of parents, of community leaders, and overwhelmingly they were Black women that responded to the study, because and many of them were mothers and educators and teachers, right? And so while some may argue that that sample may be skewed, I would say that that actually strengthened our study, because that perspective shed a lot of light on what was happening in homes and schools and communities, right? And the communities that we looked at were Atlanta, Georgia, Washington, D.C., Boston, Massachusetts, Detroit, Michigan, Las Vegas, Nevada, and New York, New York. And we did that just to kind of get a sense of whether or not geography and place really, shaped or changed the experiences of the individuals that we spoke with. And we found that it really didn't. Again, it's exploratory, but we were kind of almost stunned at the similarity of experiences despite where people lived and where they went to school and where they worked. And so these are just a couple of the key points that I think underscore what many of us already knew. Again, none of this was particularly shocking, but I think the contribution is that it comes directly from people in community. And so, 57% of participants had impacts to their employment. We heard a lot about that in the previous presentation from Chris Wheat around just the implications for being able to earn a living, what that means even for small business owners, and just to be able to sustain yourselves. I think there's been, again, a lot of discussion in policy circles about the impacts, but it's easy to forget sometimes when you're doing a research study that people are hurting. People are trying to make ends meet. They're trying to support their children and their families. And so that really becomes the impetus for why we're trying to really understand what's going on so that we can begin to address it. 1 out of 3 participants experienced mental health impacts. I would argue that we're all, still kind of dealing with the consequences of that mentally, emotionally. as well as physically and financially. 1/5 of participants, and again, all of our participants were identified as Black. I don't think I mentioned that, but that was the pool that we were pulling from. 1/5 of participants lost a friend or community member, so the loss, grief, and having to do that in places where you couldn't really be with family was tremendously difficult. More than 90% of participants said their personal lives were impacted, right? Not being able to be with family and friends or go to your house of worship, and enjoy many of the supports that you would have had, right, prior to the pandemic. Also, again, had a detrimental impact on the participants that we engaged with. And then more than half of participants experienced impacts on schooling, a lack of personal space, and difficulty balancing home and work. And again, this looks different across income ranges and location. In a place like New York City, you know, when people were confined to a very small area and not able to go anywhere, it definitely had severe impacts on individuals. And so as I mentioned, the study findings are not terribly shocking, but I think, again, it's important to underscore them to inform policy and practice and amplifying the voices of Black students, families, and communities. And so the first was that it indeed had a disproportionate and traumatic impact on the stakeholders that we looked at, that there was certainly increased racial trauma and mental health trauma. Because in addition to the trauma associated with the pandemic, remember the political environment, right, that I would argue, you know, contributed to the pandemic. It informed it in terms of it continuing a lot longer than it probably needed to be. But again, how do I say this? But we were in the Trump era, right? And we were also dealing with a lot of psychological and emotional violence happening in schools, racist acts toward Black children, with no really accountability or consequence. We then witnessed the insurrection on January 6th. And so a lot of, and you know, I didn't even mention that, you know, the death of George Floyd is what really triggered the grant call, right, that led to all of this. So the question then becomes, how does racial trauma, which also doesn't really get addressed or recognized in many of the models that we use in research, inform what's happening in schools and how children and families are experiencing it? And that schools basically are not equipped to meet the social, emotional, and academic needs of Black students. I mean, there's extensive research that shows, and we know, that our education system as it is designed was not designed to serve quote unquote minority students, that the system is designed to perpetuate the power and the powers in the racial hierarchy that currently exist, right? And so in education, for those who are committed to critical approaches in equity and social justice, you know, we acknowledge that. We know that the system was not designed for the advancement of the intellectual development and academic ability of people of color. The pandemic only made that clearer, I think, to a lot of parents and family members who are witnessing, you know, some problematic behavior, whether watching their child, you know, engaging in virtual learning, you know, hearing the things that teachers were saying and doing, the ways that their children were being treated. And so, again, it's not a secret, and it's not anything that parents and teachers weren't aware of, but it became more public and visible, like a lot of other challenges as a result of COVID. Let's see. The failed responses, again, to the pandemic just further exacerbated the fact that there has already been an issue of trust between schools, many public institutions, and African-American communities. And so this just further reduced it. I mean, even for some, I think they were very optimistic, educators and parents that were interviewed in the focus groups, you know, many of them are like, wow, I knew it was bad, but I didn't know. Like, I didn't know it was this bad. And so I think for a lot of people, too, it heightened kind of their sensitivity around their inability to trust public institutions, to trust what was happening in their schools. And we actually see this as a consequence, well, we say a consequence of this being Black children being homeschooled, staying at home, Black parents preferring virtual learning in a lot of instances because they are concerned about not only the physical safety of their children, but the psychological safety of their children in the school environment. And then finally, it was that leaders and policymakers at every level have to be held accountable for their decisions, right? And so while in education there's a large narrative around accountability, whether test scores are going up, achievement gaps are being closed, and learning outcomes are being realized, you know, where is the accountability for those who we have elected to office, for those who we have appointed, and for those who we expect for us to lead and to make policy decisions that actually help improve our quality of life? how do we hold them accountable for meeting the needs of Black students in particular, right? So those were, again, findings that have been echoed by scholars like Vanessa Siddle-Walker. We could probably go back to DuBois and Carter G. Woodson as well in thinking about the miseducation of Black children and how, again, COVID, I think, helped to really reveal the problems that we've been experiencing in the education sector. And so, as I said, I don't want to spend too much time on the problems, but really to use them as a foundation for the recommendations that we have for researchers, practitioners, and policymakers, and in many ways an agenda that Burke has really adopted in terms of what we want to focus on as a research center, in terms of figuring out how we address these problems that are very complex, that are historical, that require political will, and that require really a greater level of education and understanding of what the purpose and values of education are in the United States. And I'll go through the recommendations, but I'll talk a little bit more about that in terms of a framework that I've developed to help us as individuals, learning communities, learning organizations, institutions, to think about how we develop ourselves as individuals, right, as well as on an organizational level to address the systemic problems that we're facing, right? So systemic problems require systemic solutions. And this is an invitation, I guess, for us to think collectively about how we identify, determine, and make a commitment to those systemic solutions so that we're not talking about this again in 2032 or 2042. And I know we got some Aggies in the house. Yeah, one of my sons goes to A&T. But time is of the essence, right? And we have young people who are dedicated and committed. So I think the sooner that we come to some agreement around what we expect our schools to be able to do and accomplish, it's time for us to really let young people lead. And part of that, again, is really incorporating their experiences and what they know and what they care about to make sure that we're, again, not stuck in the same cycle. So the first recommendation stemmed from the interest in protecting and defending the rights of Black students to receive an appropriate and equitable education in a safe, welcoming, and affirming learning environment. This is really what the Brown versus Board of Education was about. The decision focused on the fact that separate educational facilities were inherently unequal, right? But the larger view of the case was to expand and ensure educational equality of opportunity for all students. That's still not happening, right? And so even as we talk about the differences between equality and equity, I actually spend quite a bit of time focusing on a commitment to equal protection under the law, right, which is our constitutional right, and making sure that that is established. And so that's really what recommendation 1 is about. It's about making sure that we put in place systems that when a Black child experiences something that they should not be experiencing in school, that they are supported, and if there is a response by adults to address that and to ensure that they have access to education like everybody else, without discrimination, without stereotyping, without low expectations, and without physical violence. We've seen young children being apprehended in school, arrested, handcuffed, et cetera, right? And so we have to find ways as a collective community to think about how we provide that support for our children, right? It's our responsibility to do that. The second recommendation is now gone, and I don't know how to read this. Okay, here we go. Is to invest in counseling, psychological, and mental health services and supports, right, to address the racial trauma that I discussed in terms of the findings of the study and its impact on Black students post-pandemic. Now, again, systemic problems require systemic solutions, and this is a really big one because we don't have enough people trained in these areas, right? We don't have enough we didn't before. And we all heard the statistics about how many students in a high school are serviced by one counselor, right? And that was for academic advising, not even mental health or, just kind of, that support system that we all need as human beings, right? And so how do we think about not only getting these supports in schools now, but developing the pipeline of culturally relevant and sensitive mental health counselors, psychologists, right, who can provide that support within the schoolhouse and in the school community, not just for students, but for the teachers and the principals as well, right, for everyone, because we've all experienced this together. And I would say our educators who have been on the front lines, have really experienced some very traumatic events over the last 2 years, and continue to do so. Just the exhaustion, the responsibility, and catching, I think, a lot of the criticism that really isn't due them, but because of the systems that we're working in, put a lot of the burden of that challenge on them. And so I think it's important to, if you know a teacher and educator, let them know you appreciate them, because it has really been a difficult time. And it leads into one of the recommendations that I'll speak to later, where we have to care for the people who care for people. We have to pour back into them, and so it's really important that we do that if we want to have a strong education system. The third is to provide that professional development to teachers and school leaders on how to meet the social, emotional, and academic needs of Black children, right? A lot of, I work in a leadership preparation program, and people don't know if you don't teach in many ways, right? Some of this stuff may be intuitive to some of it is not. And for many of our educators, we have to make sure that they're not only receiving the proper training as they enter the profession, but that we are providing ongoing professional learning and development opportunities, right? So once you're in the classroom, it's one thing to have the degree and be there, but how do you continue to grow and develop, right, in ways where you can then, again, continue to pour into your students in ways that you wouldn't without ongoing support yourself. An additional part of this is providing the professional development that focuses on culturally relevant practices. In the case of New York City, we're developing the first ever Black Studies curriculum. It's K-12 for 1.1 million students. We're so excited about that. The New York City Council funded this project. We have a lot of support to do that. But are people ready to teach Black Studies? Are the teachers that we currently have in the schools prepared to do that? Even as researchers, right, do we know enough about Black Studies, ethnic studies curriculum to prepare the people who are going to be teaching the children, right? And so while that is, I think, certainly a challenge and something that we're working on, and certainly worthy of working on, one of the exciting things about it is that this is an opportunity where children know, in many cases, as much, or it may be more, than the adults in this instance, right? And so it's an opportunity to allow students as young as, the ones that Miss Alexandria works with, early learning, pre-K, kindergarten, K through 5, to lead their own learning and helping us to understand their culture. Tell us about your family, your culture, where you're from, who you are, what you desire, what you dream about, right? And really catering their educational experience to their interests and facilitating that. One of my mentors, who I'm just so excited to call a mentor, is Professor Edmund Gordon, who's at Teachers College. He's a psychologist and political economist. He's 101 years old, and I'm trying to keep up with him, y'all. Trying to keep up. Text, emails, constant ideas about the future of education. And he's told me on more than one occasion that, teaching will be obsolete. He said with the internet, with the technology that is accessible now, you don't really need a teacher in the same way. You don't need someone to sit and teach you the content. What you need is someone who supports the affirmative development of your academic ability, someone who can facilitate your learning, right? And so if you're someone who says you're interested in Black feminist thought, right? If you have a young person who's interested in that, we have to train our teachers to be able to point them in the right direction, to support what it is that they're interested in. But there's no way that you will be able to know everything, right, that needs to be known. But it's important that we focus on pedagogy, right, and facilitating that learning and being a support system for young people. So it was shocking to kind of hear him say that teaching would not be teaching anymore, but when you really think about how children learn now and how they access information, I certainly think that there is something that we should pay attention to as we talk about putting the curriculum on TikTok, for example, which I'm not on yet, right? And so we have to humble ourselves to know what we don't know and be able to bridge those intergenerational divides, right? In order to really support our children, because they are living in a very different world. Okay. The fourth was to modernize curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment, and I've kind of actually talked about this in the previous point. One of the ways that we're doing this at Burke is a design labs project, where we are really working, we're co-constructing curriculum with teachers and students in the school, in the classrooms. As well as assessment, right? And so one of the things we don't want to overlook is the importance of the test scores to policymakers. We know that that's important. We might not like it, But we know that assessment is critical, but we need to look at that along with curriculum and pedagogy, right? So if you're assessing students on something, have you taught them the thing that you're, that you're assessing them on, right? So we're, again, excited about these spaces where we can really experiment in ways to co-construct curriculum, better understand how students learn and how teachers teach and how to do that effectively. Again, to address the findings that we found where parents just feel like what's being taught is not correct. A lot of teachers don't know what they're doing. I have to reteach my child. My child knows what they're getting is not accurate, especially when it comes to topics like Black history and Black studies. And so we want to make sure that we are properly training and preparing teachers and educators to teach the truth, which came up quite a bit again in the study. As we're engaged in these debates around critical race theory, we have to teach the truth, and we have to be bold in doing that. There are many teachers who want to do that, and they need the support to be able to do that. The fifth recommendation was to invest in the preparation, cultivation, and mentoring of culturally relevant educators. And so as we think about the problems we have now, we still need people thinking long term. And this is my big frustration, is that we're a very reactionary society. What will our schools look like in 20 years, and who are the teachers that we're pouring into now who will be the teachers in 5, 10, 20 years, right? We have to be very intentional about their preparation. I have strong feelings about what has happened in teacher preparation and certification over the last decade or so, where it's basically, if you have a bachelor's degree, you can be in a classroom in a high-needs community. And I think, unfortunately, that has done a lot of damage in the communities that we have been working in because it is focused on a test score. You don't have people who are really seasoned in how to teach and also don't know the community that they're working in. And that has damaging effects, right? Teaching is a really important and valuable profession, and so we have to treat it as such. We have to respect those who are in the profession, and we have to really be attentive to the pipeline. There's some amazing efforts being done, like groups like the Center for Black Educator Development with Sharif El-Mekki, who's really trying to increase the number of Black male teachers in classrooms. And I think we have to, again, create the environment where people want to teach. They want, it's fun, they're able to see the rewarding outcomes of helping people, inspiring individuals, right, to pursue their passions, and they're compensated for it. You can, have a family, raise a family, and live the type of lifestyle that you want. And so that also is a priority in terms of thinking about the long term and how we're investing in young people now who will be the teachers of tomorrow, and making sure that they have the emotional maturity, the critical consciousness, and the culture, the knowledge, the cultural knowledge to be able to be effective with diverse students, with a diverse group of students. Because people aren't diverse. And then finally, we want to restore and rebuild community trust by engaging Black students, families, educators, researchers, and leaders as experts and equal partners in education, okay? I think this conference is an excellent, and the Cook Center is an excellent example of the scholarship and research that we have at our disposal. There's a long tradition of this work. Again, nothing is new. It's just the context that we're in and being able to translate that information in ways that really result in real outcomes for real people, right? At Burke, we want to look back and see, or we want to go into classrooms across the country and see children smiling and laughing, reading books, and seeing images that look like them, where they are curious, and not only tapping into what they're interested in, but then having the tools to solve some of our most perennial problems in society, right? They can figure out how to help close the wealth gap. The young people will be able to determine how we address climate change, right, and environmental racism. So it's our responsibility to help fuel that, or else, again, we're just going to be, I don't want to give this presentation again in 10 years. And so how do we think about ways to advance these recommendations so that when we come together again, we can point to the gains, we can show examples of how this is working, and can, to me, and I do think big, but demonstrate a pivotal moment in US history where the education system has been transformed to really reflect the larger aims of this nation, okay? All right, so how do we do this? And I just wanted to share one of the quotes that came from a focus group, and that was that Black education has to be something more along the lines of soul work, right? Which was profound because, again, we focus on, and it's important. We have to teach literacy. We have to teach mathematics. We have to teach science. We're not disputing that. We need to have systems of accountability to know whether that's happening, right? I have 3 children. They're big now, but I have one that's still in school, high school, and I want to know if she's learning, right? And I want to know that even from my conversations. I want her to teach me things, right? But it's more than just a test. It's also that engagement. It's that intellectual curiosity, right, that they bring. And so that soul work is important. It's harder to quantify. But rather than continuing to only value what we can measure in terms of a one-time test score, we have to begin to measure what it is that we value, right? And that requires an activity, an exercise where communities come together to really articulate what we value. What do we really value in education? What matters most to us? And once we've established that, how do we work together to make that happen, right? But you can't make change when you don't know exactly where it is that you're going, right? And I think we're at a point in this nation, too, where there's just so much, there's so many polarizing political views and tensions that it makes it hard to kind of think about how we move forward. But that's the work that has to happen right now. We have to think about a common vision for education and a common vision for society and what we really want this country to be. Because there are certainly people who have a strong opinion about that. The scale framework? How am I on time? I know lunch is right after me. Oh, it's missing. So, but I wanted to quickly just talk about a framework, the framework that I referenced earlier called the scale framework. And if you have access online, if you go to our website, blackedresearch.org, you can see a visual of it there. I've modified it a little bit, but basically SCALE stands for 5 elements that I view as being really important to advancing culturally relevant and appropriate education. S stands for, I love acronyms too, so S stands for self-knowledge, right? And that really we can't do any of this work without having a deeper understanding of who we are. You can't even really lead others or teach others if you don't know who you are and where you're positioned. And so in terms of our professional learning series, we're going to spend quite a bit of time with leaders, with individuals. Again, this applies across sectors and across the lifespan. Who are you? Where do you come from? Mind, body, spirit, right? Just all of the things that make us human. I'm always curious about just the fact that we don't even really know much about the human bodies that we walk in every day. You know, I've been in this body for 47 years. And, you know, how much do we really know about, again, who we are, how we work, how we operate, how our mind, body, and spirit connect with one another, right? And all of that is really important to education. So we want to spend time reflecting on self-knowledge. This is going back to, again, what was written on the Egyptian temple walls, know thyself. We have to know ourselves in order to be able to even begin to engage and support others. The C in SCALE stands for culture. And culture means many things, but in education it's everything because education is literally the transmission of cultural values, right? We kind of talk about it in the terms of schooling, which I would argue, as Molly Mashuja has, schooling is different than education. Schooling is what we do in school. It's, you know, it's the rote stuff, it's the testing, it's the stuff that, you know, my kids have said it too, we just going through the motions. But I don't feel like I'm really learning much. That's a sad thing to think. The children are in school for 13 years. It's probably funner, you know, in the earlier years, but all of the money, the investment in time. Teachers are disgruntled, the students don't feel like we have to change this. We cannot continue to do this. I'm sorry, I'm just getting on to it, but it's really weird, but education is the transmission of cultural values, right? And so because we bring so many different cultures to bear in the United States, this is what we're seeing now, right? Whose history? Whose truths? What purpose? To what end? But when we recognize that education is really the transmission of the cultural values that we hold dear, then I think that helps us to think about what it is that we're actually teaching. What are those cultural values and norms? And to what extent can we really do that for populations that are culturally pluralistic, right? Where in one classroom I might have 12 cultures represented, and some of them may actually be in tension with each other in terms of their values. How does an educator address that, right? The first step is just knowing, again, who you are, and then understand that culture is really important to learning and teaching. The third element of SCALE, which is A, is agency, okay? And that, to me, is important because I think it's easy to feel defeated, deflated, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the problems that we're facing, right? Racism, sexism, violence, war, you name it. We're really experiencing all of that right now, okay? But it's important to recognize that we are the creators of our own destiny at the end of the day. It's easy to forget it amidst everything, but we are the creators of our own destiny. And so agency is helping to remind young people, as well as ourselves, that we have agency, that self-determination is important, that we are independent, and that we have to kind of push against the grain, and that we have so many amazing leaders in history and in the present that have demonstrated that agency, that serve as examples of what can be done in times of crisis and tremendous difficulty. The L stands for leadership. And again, I'm a leadership scholar, so this is an area that's really important to me. But we continue to have, I think really, I won't say a crisis in leadership, it's too cliche, but I think there's ways that we can continue to really improve the way that we think about leadership, that we engage as leaders, and that we establish certain expectations for leadership, and the type of qualities that a leader needs to possess. And so scale, again, is thinking not only about how I am a creator of my own destiny, but once you decide to be a leader, that you are now taking on and assuming the responsibility of the destiny of others. And so what does that mean within the context of education, community leadership, and social equity? And then finally, the last aspect of scale, the E stands for ethics and enduring values. Okay? And again, ethics is something that used to be taught all the time in leadership. I don't know if we still do it. It feels like there's a vacuum there, right? But what do you value? Why are you getting up every day to do what you do? And how do you then inspire others to advance the vision that we've set for ourselves, to really, again, articulate those values and then embody them? And so we really draw from the principles of Ma'at, right, Kemetic wisdom, where, and the goddess Ma'at really represents the scales, which is what the framework is called, right? But balancing the heart against a feather, right, is how the story goes, right? But it's really about our pursuit of harmony, of balance, of justice, right? And in many ways, I think that's what the equity conversation is about, a lot of definitions of equity and how we conceive it and how we measure it. And we say that's where we want to go, but again, what does that mean when we're confronted with these difficult decisions? And how do we, again, shift from a place of division, polarization, conflict, yelling and talking over each other, rather than pursuing peace and harmony and justice and balance. And so that's what we're really uplifting in the framework. And again, those elements, while they tie very nicely to, I think, pedagogies associated with Black studies and culturally relevant pedagogy, the point of the framework, which is focused on, learning and leading, is that my hope is that everyone can see themselves in that framework, no matter who you are, what cultural community you come from, what neighborhood, right? That self-knowledge, culture, agency, leadership, and ethics are all things that at least give us a common framework and language to then talk about, the similarities and differences that we might have in each and how we can learn from one another in order, again, to learn from our history, from the very tough lessons that we've learned during the pandemic. And not only surviving, but realizing that we are creators of our future and that we have the power, if we work together, if we communicate those values, to really make them happen. And I think that education is so critical to that. And that's why I'm so passionate about the field of education, because that's where that's where it all happens. And so we've got to address the crisis that we are experiencing in education. We cannot continue to have this conflict. We must be able to provide safe spaces for children and really, again, go back to the recommendations that were offered in the report. So I thank you all for listening. I thank you for the work that each of you do and your commitment to really addressing inequality. And I look forward, hopefully, to a movement where we will begin to transform our schools in ways where they are safe places for all children and a place where all children can call home. Thank you.
about this framework. You're talking about establishing a strong critical and racial consciousness within our youth. My question then is, have y'all looked at the passing of Black Education Acts within your study and how that has impacted the framework, education, and Black community? And if you did, can you speak to it a little bit?
Thank you for your question. We have not. I mean, part of the curriculum work that we're doing right now is doing, a landscape analysis of ethnic studies legislation, the work that's being done, including some of the, like there's a Black reparations package I know in Oakland focused on schools. I think a lot of it echoes though, like what I talked about today. I mean, it's really curriculum, pedagogy, professional development, providing resources and representation. And so that's why, for me, I think we're ready to mobilize, because I don't think there's a lot of disagreement around what needs to happen. It is just the strategy around how you mobilize community, how you participate in political action, right, and hold individuals accountable. So for me, I think a lot of this has been settled. I won't say settled, but well-rooted in the research community in terms of what needs to happen around Black education. And the push now is, how do you engage in the political process and shape policy and engage in policy advocacy that makes it happen. So for me, I feel like that is the phase that we need to focus on, and that the pandemic in many ways just, for me, it like gave the green light. It's like, okay, we've seen these themes so many times, and even hearing across sectors, the challenges in higher education, for example, the challenges in wealth inequality, workforce development, all of that. I think it's time, as I'm saying, and this is my new message, it's time to build a new house. Like, we know that it's time to do it. I don't know what else to say. Like, we just have to
How do you do it when you have interest divergence, right? So you have interest convergence
Right.
from Brother Bell, but you have active forces that are trying to dismantle the culture of presence and education. So I think that's where I'm going.
Well, you can't, I mean, so there's building and there's fighting, right? And then there's building. And so I think it's a time to build, and everyone has a different role in the struggle. So I think it's just a multi-pronged approach whereby we need our activists. We need the people to resist and protest. We also need the people who can be at the table, at the budget hearing, or at the budget decision-making table, right, where a lot of us are not represented. We need to have people who are in the classrooms. We need to have people in higher ed who are preparing the teachers. And so that's why Burke, again, we're very transdisciplinary, because we recognize, it's like basketball. Everybody can't be the center or the point guard. What position are you playing? And do you know the plays? And are we communicating? And so I think it's just, again, finding, and I just feel like the folks are out there and ready. I don't know where's the coach? Maybe we just need the coach to bring everybody together, but I feel like the pieces are there. But the next step is like to assemble the team and then map out the play and execute it. So I know I made it sound simpler than it might be, but I think I think it's happening at the local community level. It's not to say people are doing this work. How do we maximize it, and optimize it? Thank you for your question. Hi.
Thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask you a couple questions about maybe like curriculum in like K through 12. I've thought a lot about this like over my life, because I grew up in Arizona, and the community that I grew up in, there was a lot of Mexican Americans, more or less, right? But it seemed like statewide the policy was very much like, we have to like distance the curriculum away from these students' heritage and culture. So that was everything from like passing like English immersion laws to banning like ethnic studies and stuff in K through 12. And I'm kind of happy with like, California actually adding like an ethnic studies requirement through K through 12. But I kind of wonder too, right? I mean, especially since like when you look at the United States, there's so much geographic diversity, right? Like in the West, there's a lot of Hispanics. In the South, there's a lot of African Americans. And in some places, like in the Midwest, there's a lot of white people, And it's like, how do you change, I mean, especially like thinking about like history, like have a more like truthful narrative that does affirm like these different groups' experiences, but also kind of like what we were talking about yesterday during the Asian American discrimination talk. How do you build more coalitions and mutual understanding and change the narrative from it being, you know, a story about a certain group of people in America to the story about all of us in America?
Yeah. No, that's a great question, and it's what we're working on. I mean, I think through dialogue, communication among people who are in the curriculum space and with families and students that we can make that happen. And that's part, it goes back to why scale, again, is kind of broad, because I think it could be used at the community level to help determine what the priorities might be in terms of what communities are represented and how that should be reflected in the curriculum. But I think at the same time, we also as a nation have to decide what we want children to know as a nation. Many countries have, you know, they incorporate the histories of multiple groups in what they teach. And so I think that's something that just we haven't done yet. And it's going to be bumpy until we figure out what, you know, the right curriculum looks like. I think curriculum always has to change too. We're writing history each day. And so it will always be kind of this ongoing iterative process. But I'm just a big advocate of having local educators and communities working with individuals who can help facilitate, right, what it is that they're trying to do and support them. And that's probably the best way to decide and make those decisions around what happens at the local and state level. The challenge, though, becomes the lack of political representation oftentimes in your state legislatures, as well as at the city council level and the school board level, right, where you may have, I'm from Las Vegas, Nevada, so you may have a student population that's, you know, 45% Latino, Latinx, but your school board doesn't represent that, nor does any other elected, you know, elected office throughout the state. And so that's why, although we focus on education, we recognize that politics, elections, and building community capacity for political power is tremendously important. And so you have to have those things working in tandem. So I know it's probably a complicated answer, but it's worth figuring out, in my opinion, because we just can't continue to do what we're doing now.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think the political aspect is super important.
Yeah, yes, indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
One last question.
Okay.
Hi, great presentation, by the way. I'm a first-year undergrad at Duke University, and I was wondering, in regards to protecting Black students, I know you mentioned putting in policies and laws that we can depend on to protect us, but I was wondering how you recommend dealing with teachers who are perpetrating this toxic environment in the education system.
Well, we have to counsel them out of the profession is probably the first thing. But this is why I emphasize, that's a great question, because I do emphasize the professional learning. And as I said, the moment revealed a lot of challenging truths. You know, I've looked at, you know, you could look at the data, again, going back to voting and politics, on, you know, who voted for who, and mapping that onto the demographic profile of our teachers. Okay, so if 78% of public school teachers are white women, and a very large share also voted for Trump, you know, I'm just wondering, right, what that looks like in the classroom. And even with the large unions, they really experience a lot of challenge with that. With like the NEA, you know, particularly who I've worked with, where a lot of their membership were, you know, some were at the insurrection posting pictures on social media. So it's like, I think it's those really big, glaring truths that we just don't really acknowledge and accept, that we have to accept right now. And so it's also, like I said, creating standards for what it means to be a qualified teacher in 2022. Counseling individuals out of the profession who are not supporting our children and actually maybe doing damage. And being very intentional about the pipeline of teachers that we're preparing who are going to care for, love, challenge, and educate our children the ways that we know. And so again, it's a long game, but the time is now.
I cannot leave without saying this. This is a political power issue in this moment. This is not just an education and who can be in the classroom. They can't get in the classroom because we don't have a political structure that is giving permission for those teachers to be there. We have school board elections right now that are being taken over by people who don't care about the things that you think should be in the classroom. And right now, today, in North Carolina, the voting population of African Americans is 18.55% after early voting. That is the lowest it has been since 2010, when this whole system got turned over to people who don't care about the things that are being said in this room today. So this is a power issue that is so beyond the pedagogy and the questions that are being addressed in this room right now. And it's extremely frustrating because I think that we have abdicated the importance of voting and civic engagement for a lot of other conversations that cannot happen unless that voting happens at scale and for power. And, you know, I really, all of the people here are smart, they're bright, they've had opportunities, they've taken advantage of them. But I am young enough and old enough to remember when we had this conversation before, and we thought we were getting to the other side of it, and we're rolling back so fast. North Carolina, the Leandro case has been decades on the books. It's not going anywhere because we have a legislature that says, no, you can't have that. So just had to say that.
I agree wholeheartedly. Thank you. Thank you.